All right, y'all. Okay, so the whole purpose of this unit is to lead up to the Civil War. Now, so that means that you know, headed that direction, that we are headed towards a Civil War. The simple definition of a Civil War is two sides of the country fighting for the control of the country. That's not exactly what happened in the American Civil War, because the South was not fighting to control America. What were they fighting for? Well, that's part of it, but they were fighting to leave the United States and have their own country called the Confederate States of America. So they weren't. So it's not in the strictest definition a civil war, but anyhow, that's the best word we can come up with for it, the North versus the South. Well, what's going to lead to that are several things. And at first, it's this idea of westward expansion. Now, when you hear westward expansion, anybody can tell me what that makes them think of?
Expand.
Yeah.
Expanding like west.
Yes, we're expanding the border of the United States out west towards what ocean? The Pacific. We started at Atlantic, right? We're going, that's in the east. That's what we call this the East Coast. Okay, this is Georgia. We're on the East Coast. We're going to the West Coast where Cali is, right? So we're headed that direction. Well, it has been going on for a while. After we defeated the British, we got their lands in the Ohio River Valley. Now we're going to take even more land, and it's called the Louisiana Purchase. Okay. So Napoleon is the leader of what country? France. He's the dictator of France. And he offers the United States a deal. Now at that time they owned what's called the Louisiana Territory. And it's much more than just the little state of Louisiana. It goes from the port there at Louisiana. What's that important port called? At the mouth of the Mississippi River. What's it called? They have big parties there in Louisiana.
Oh, the river.
New Orleans.
Oh.
New Orleans. It's the capital, right?
Yeah.
So where Mississippi empties, with the Mississippi River empties into the Gulf of Mexico, very important port there. That's at Louisiana. And it goes from Louisiana all the way up to Canada. That's how big it was. In fact, this is going to more than double the size of the United States. And France owns all that land, so they cut us a deal. They cut us a deal. All right? So they're going to offer this to us for a measly $15 million. Now, that sounds like a lot of money. But when you consider it's only about 6 cents an acre, that's pretty good, isn't it? So the French lands are going to double the size of the United States and allow Western farmers use of the Mississippi, and we can move even further west. Now here's the problem. When this happens, the President of the United States was Thomas Jefferson. He was number 3, right? Who was number 1? Washington. Who was number 2? John Adams, and then Thomas Jefferson. Okay, Jefferson has a problem. It says his quandary. That's his problem. Is that he was a strict constitutionalist. Now, a strict constitutionalist is what the anti-federalists and the Democratic Republicans were. That means what the Constitution says is what it means, and what it doesn't say, the government can't do. Now, is there anything in the Constitution, to your recollection, that says that America can go and buy land? Not a word about it. So in his mind, he's thinking, well, if it doesn't say it, I can't do it. So his problem is, I got to do this. This is a heck of a deal. The people expect me to do it, but it's against my principles. So he ultimately decides against his own principles, and he submitted a treaty to the Senate. Okay, so the president can't just sign a treaty. He's got to send it to the Senate, in the Congress for them to approve it first. It's one of the checks and balances, okay? All right. Now, if you look at this, there's a lot of stuff on here that I didn't draw, but you see this light color, like guacamole green on this side, and the darker green is on this side. All right, the darker green is what we owned before the Louisiana Purchase, and then this guacamole green is the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, this was the Louisiana Territory. All of this up above Canada, actually. That's what that line represents. It's way up there. Now we eventually fixed that later, but when we buy this land from France, we get all this land, and you see how it looks like a butterfly, doesn't it? So if you see a map that looks like sort of like a butterfly of the United States, that is the Louisiana Purchase map. Okay? So again, it more than doubles our size. And again, here's where the state of Louisiana is today, and there's where the port of New Orleans is, where the Mississippi runs south. What river is this over here? Savannah's down here in Georgia. What's this?
The Ohio River, just kidding.
What made this land special over here?
Ohio River.
Ohio. That's Ohio River.
Right.
Okay? And then what is this that goes out west? I don't expect you to know that. Mississippi runs south. Chattahoochee's in Georgia.
They are out there.
Listen, this is the Missouri River.
I knew that.
Okay? So listen to me. When we go out west to explore this area, we're going to need to go on the Missouri River to go west. You can take the Ohio River to go east, or you come up here to the Great Lakes, and right here, you've got the Mississippi River to go south. Okay? These rivers are very important. This is how you move stuff around. Okay? All right. All right. So this picture here, this is the transfer of the Louisiana lands to the United States. You can see there's some Native Americans there in the picture. But in the Senate, there is fierce opposition. Fierce opposition. They don't want it. They said, we don't need this. But on December 20th, 1803, Louisiana finally became part of the United States. One effect of the purchase was a spark in the interest of Americans to move westward. This is called westward expansion. Okay? So know that the Senate was not for it. But it became official December 20th, 1803. And this gave interest to Americans to move westward. This gave interest in westward expansion. Everybody good? Those of you taking notes without filling the blanks, you don't have to write every single word, okay? Just make sure you know what it means. Okay? So now that we have this land, we need to explore it. So Thomas Jefferson hires two guys, Lewis and Clark, that's their last names, Captain Meriwether Lewis and Captain William Clark. They are hired to go and explore Louisiana Territory, because now we've doubled in size, but we don't have a clue what's out there. It's never been mapped before. Don't have a clue. It's all wilderness. The only stuff that lives out there are wild animals. Lots of buffalo live out that way, and Native Americans. That's it. That's all that lives out there. Okay? So when you watch these old westerns on TV, that's what it's about. These guys going out west and conquering the Wild West. So they're supposed to explore Louisiana Territory. Now, they didn't go by themselves. They were assisted by a young Native American girl by the name of Sacagawea. You've probably heard of that name before. Sacagawea spoke, of course, the Native American languages, and she was able to help them communicate with the Native Americans as they went west and explored this territory. They traveled along the Missouri River in order to go west. So there's 3 rivers we've talked about that are super important right now. The Mississippi goes what direction? South. The Ohio goes east, and Missouri goes west. That's important. Those are the major waterways that go the directions that we need to know about. Okay? Now this picture here, you got a picture of Lewis and Clark having a conversation with Native Americans there. It's not Lois and Clark, as in Lois Lane from Superman and Clark Kent. It's Lewis, L-E-W-I-S. All right? So remember, Lewis and Clark are the ones that Jefferson hires to explore Louisiana territory. Sacagawea helped them. They traveled on the Missouri River. Okay? You don't have to write that part there. Everybody good? All right. Now, during this time, we also had a very, very important Supreme Court case called Marbury versus Madison. Now, to make sure you understand, whenever we have a court case, it's not going to say VS for versus, it's going to say Marbury v. Madison. That's just the way they write it. So if you ever see that, some people get confused and think that's a person's name and like the V is the middle initial or something. No, if it ever has a V there, it is a court case. Somebody with the last name Marbury versus somebody with the last name Madison. You got me? Now this is an important precedent that is set. This is the first Supreme Court case to establish the concept of judicial review. Okay? So if you're writing this, Marbury v. Madison establishes judicial review. They use Article 3 of the Constitution in order to do that. Now, what does judicial review mean? It's the ability of the Supreme Court to decide whether or not a law is constitutional or not. So if a law goes against the principles in our Constitution, it is declared unconstitutional. If it goes right along with the principles in our Constitution, it's called constitutional, and they'll let it stand. So picture this. Congress passes a law. The President signs a law. What happens to that law? It becomes a law, but unless the Supreme Court looks at it and throws it out and says this is unconstitutional. It's against the principles in our Constitution. We're throwing it out. Does that make sense? So, back up. Marbury versus Madison establishes judicial review. Judicial review is the ability of the Supreme Court to decide the constitutionality, that is, whether a law is constitutional or not. It's either constitutional or unconstitutional, and it's part of the checks and balances. Just because our Congress wants it and our President wants it doesn't necessarily mean it's what's best for us, does it? And that's what our Supreme Court essentially does. Okay? Now, they don't look at every single law that's passed, but if they see one that interests them, they will look at it. And they'll vote, and they'll decide which one they want to go with it. Is it constitutional or unconstitutional? So you need to know this very important court case, Marbury versus Madison, 1803, establishes judicial review. Everybody good? All right. Now, during this time, there was a lot of stuff that was going on. Who had we just beaten in the American Revolution? Britain. But guess what? Britain didn't go anywhere. They were hanging around up in Canada waiting on us to mess up so they could come back in and take us back over. Okay? They didn't think we were going to make it. So they started doing things to poke at us, to provoke us. You ever had somebody poke at you just trying to make you mad before? Uh-huh. Brother or sister or somebody? Your neighbor? Right? That's what they're doing. Well, they did something called impressment. Okay? You need to write that word, I-M-P-R-E-S-S-M-E-N-T, impressment. British impressment. So what it meant was that the British would kidnap our men and force them to serve on Britain's boats. They called them floating hales because they were so bad. They forced them to serve, and if they didn't, they would kill them. Forced them to serve. That's what impressment is. They were impressing our soldiers. That means forcing them. Okay? That doesn't mean, wow, I'm really impressed with the work you did. Same word, but different meaning. It means I'm impressing you and forcing you to do something. They were being forced to serve in the British Navy. Now, how do you think we're going to react to Britain kidnapping our people and forcing them to serve in their Navy? We're mad. So we're going to fight Britain a second time. Well, Adams was president at the time. He was the second president. And he was being neutral. Why was he being neutral? Because George Washington said we should be neutral and not get involved in other people's affairs. However, do you think George Washington would have put up with England kidnapping our people?
No.
No, of course not. And the group, the Democratic Republicans, because remember Adams was a Federalist, the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson and Madison were mad. They said, you can't be neutral about this. They're kidnapping our people. You got to do something about it. A Republican newspaper described President Adams as old, grumbly, bald, toothless Adams. Now, were they saying he literally had no teeth? No. What do they mean by somebody's toothless? Yeah, they won't do anything. They're going to poke out about it, right? They're not going to do anything about it. That's what they meant. Okay? So the British stopped neutral American ships to search for deserters from the Royal Navy. Anyone who even sounded British was in danger of being impressed into the British Navy. Okay? Is this a big deal? Sure it is. Would Americans put up with their people getting kidnapped today? No, we don't put up with that sort of thing. We defend our folks. Now, looking at this picture here, we've got Indians, and we've got American soldiers. The United States Army's always had blue uniforms. Okay, in the Civil War, they're going to have blue. The Confederates are going to have gray. All right? However, let's take a close look at this picture. What do you see?
Indians.
Now, there's some Indians getting stabbed there. What else do we notice? Let's go a little closer.
2 American guys do.
What do the Indians have?
Hatchets. Guns.
Guns!
Are you serious?
How the heck did the Indians get guns?
Oh.
Let's look a little, not with the French. This is way after the French and Indian War. The French were our friends. We just bought the Louisiana Purchase from them. Why would they be selling them guns? Think about it. They used to have a good relationship, but look at this. Let's look a little closer. Let's look at this gun right here.
That's a musket.
Oh, you didn't see that. Made in Great Britain. Who gave them the guns? The British were giving the Indians guns and telling them to attack them. Okay, so I had a little recording malfunction there, but as I was saying before, part of the problem is that the Native Americans are getting guns from the British. So the things are piling up that the British are doing that are making the Americans angry, that are going to lead us into a second war with them called the War of 1812. And they're giving guns to the Native Americans, and the Native Americans are attacking the Americans. So this is very much similar to what happened during the French and Indian War, when the French were giving the Native Americans guns and telling them to attack the British. So this leads us to somewhat of a list of things that lead to the War of 1812 against the British. So again, a second war that we're going to fight with them. And we very nearly lost it. And in losing that, we would have lost our independence, and therefore the American Revolution basically would have been for nothing. But the reasons we fight this war against the British is, first of all, the harassment of American ships by the British. That's called impressment. And the Chesapeake incident, which is a version of that. Impressment, again, simply means they were kidnapping Americans and forcing them to serve on the British ships in the Navy. Also, in doing so, they were interfering with our trade. So taking our ships messes with our economy. So that's another problem that we have with them. Then also, like we just talked about, the discovery of British weapons being used by Native Americans in battles against the United States. So all of these things add up. So we've got several things here. We've got impressment, them taking our soldiers, forcing them to serve on the British ships. We've got trade restrictions because they're messing with our ships and therefore messing with our economy. We've got them giving guns to the Native Americans, that is the British giving guns to the Native Americans, telling them to attack us. And then also, don't forget, we've got a really good friendship with France after the American Revolution, and so the British don't like that very much, so we're allied with their enemy. So that's a problem that they have with us as well. So those are the different causes of the War of 1812, if you pay attention to your poster for the second 9 weeks. So during the War of 1812, James Madison, who is the father of the Constitution of the United States, he's the guy who writes it. He's from Virginia. He is the president during the War of 1812. He's the guy who's going to have to deal with that. This is another key figure that you're going to see during this war, and it's John C. Calhoun. He is a senator from South Carolina. He's the future vice president of the United States, at least for a little while. He's going to have to quit in the middle of that. We'll talk about that later. But he called this upcoming conflict against the British the second struggle for our liberty. And he was right. It was our second American Revolution. And he was a part of a group of senators called the War Hawks. They were senators that always wanted to go to war. So John C. Calhoun, South Carolina, leader of the War Hawks, and he understood that we were actually going to go to war with the British. It was inevitable that we would go again. All right? So that leads us to another incident that happens in the War of 1812. It's called the defense of Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry was attacked by the British, and at that battle, there was a lawyer by the name of Francis Scott Key who watched what happened as the British attacked this tiny little fort, and they made a deal with the people who were inside the fort. They said, if you'll take your flag down, if you'll take your American flag down, that'll be our symbol to know that the war is over. And all throughout the night, every time the flag went down, they picked it back up and put it back up, even though it was in shreds, because they refused to lower the flag. And in watching this, he wrote this poem that we now call our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. So he wrote this song about it, and he said basically that he was watching all throughout the night, and he could see the flag flying through the red glare of the lights. And that's what the story is about, and how when everything cleared up the next morning, the flag was still flying there, that they wouldn't give up. So that's where our national anthem came from, and it was about the courage of the people at the defense of Fort McHenry. That's Francis Scott Key, again a Virginia lawyer who wrote the poem entitled The Defense of Fort McHenry, which is going to become our national anthem. Now, during the War of 1812, it was actually very close. The British invaded Washington, D.C., and they attacked the Capitol. In fact, they had to evacuate the White House, or the Executive Mansion, they called it at the time. and that's where that's where James Madison lived, and his wife, the First Lady, was Dolly Madison. And the one thing she was able to save as the British were getting closer was a big portrait of George Washington. She knew that that was something that was going to be very valuable, and now it still hangs in the White House today, but she saved it. And sure enough, when the British got there, they burnt down the White House, and they also burnt down the United States Capitol. They very, very nearly took us back over. Well, had it not been, we're giving him applause there, had it not been for this great man, our great general during the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson, we very well may have lost the War of 1812. He was a great leader during this time, and the war was actually over before the battle he's most known for. The battle he's most known for is the Battle of New Orleans. So he was fighting against the British there, and he was told that the war was over, but he kept fighting the British anyway because he wanted to kill as many redcoats as he possibly could. He hated the British. They had tortured him. They had killed his brother during the American Revolution, and he absolutely hated the British. So he killed as many of them as he could in New Orleans. But this was a huge victory, and that made him a national hero, and eventually he would become President of the United States. And he was one of the most popular that we ever had. Matter of fact, he went marching into Florida, took over Florida. We weren't even at war with the Spanish, and he took over Florida and became the governor of Florida. And anyway, we wound up having to give Florida back to the Spanish for a little while. But they did name a big city after him. It's called Jacksonville, Florida. So that's supposed to be at the Battle of New Orleans. And of course, there's Jackson there, and he became that first provincial governor of Florida, but just for a little while because we had to give it back. But Jacksonville, ironically, is the largest in terms of square footage. It is the largest city in the world. Doesn't have the most people in the world, but there's enough space in Jacksonville, Florida, to fit every woman, man, and child in the entire world. You can fit them in Jacksonville. That's how big the city is. Now, occurrences of the War of 1812. Again, the British ships blockaded the eastern seacoast. That means they lined their ships up along our beach and would not let any ships come or go, which is important because if we can't ship anything and we can't receive anything, eventually we're going to run out of stuff. So those are called blockades. They blocked us in. The White House and the Capitol were both burned to the ground. Eventually, of course, we rebuilt them. But the U.S. won at the Battle of New Orleans, of which General Andrew Jackson became the hero. He became the hero. They called Andrew Jackson a lot of things. They called him Old Hickory. And he was just a sort of an everyman kind of guy. They all liked him. The next U.S. president, the 5th president, his name is James Monroe. James Monroe. So, after we win the War of 1812, we've sort of got this, almost like we have room to be a little cocky. You know what I'm saying? We had this room to be a little arrogant. We just whipped the British a second time. We just proved to them that we're Americans and we can stand on our own and we don't have to have anybody else to help us. So James Monroe comes in after the War of 1812, during this time when everybody's feeling good about being an American. And we call this the era of good feelings. Era of good feelings. In fact, there was basically only one political party during this time, and they were the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists had kind of disappeared. So everybody was some version of a Democratic Republican during this time. Well, James Monroe and his Secretary of State, who is the son of our 2nd president, John Adams, his name is John Quincy Adams, they'd come up with a new plan for how to address Europeans. And it's called the Monroe Doctrine. And basically it warns Europeans to keep their monarchical system, their colonization system, their mercantilist system out of the Americas. Basically, we're warning them to stay out of our hemisphere. We're the big dog now in the Americas. This is our neighborhood. Europeans, you guys stay out. That's the Monroe Doctrine. Okay? So basically, if you consider it like this represents the entire world. This is us, of course. We're the sheriff in town. There's America. And then we've got Europe. Basically, we're telling the Europeans that this area right here, North America, South America, and the Caribbean, is off limits. You may not come here. You may not colonize here. This area belongs to us. This is our neighborhood. You guys can stay out. So, really quickly in words here, the Monroe Doctrine aimed to free the Western Hemisphere of European influence. Did not want Europeans to have any more influence on the United States or the areas around that. It was a response to the interest of European nations in creating colonies in North and South America. We told them, you better find another place to colonize. We're not letting you do that over here in the Americas anymore. And it ordered European powers to abandon their existing colonies in the Western Hemisphere. So this is us getting awful high and mighty, telling those countries that have had their colonies here for a long time that they're going to have to abandon them and leave them, which of course they don't listen to us right away. It's going to take a long time before that happens. Okay?